I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, Ukrainian troops cross the border in Belgorod as fighting continues in Kursk, and Russian troops advance on Pokrovsk. We also bring you the latest diplomatic and political updates from across the world, and we speak with Velina Tchakarova, a security analyst based in Vienna.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 27th of August, 2 years and 190 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, and our guest is security analyst Velina Tchakarova. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Well, hi David, hi team, welcome Velina. So let's start with this report that's just breaking in the last couple of hours about another supposed Ukrainian border crossing. Russian officials saying that Ukrainian forces have attempted to break into Russia's Belgorod region. That's the southern region bordering Kursk, just to the south of Kursk. Now Moscow says the area came under attack by 500 Ukrainian troops, pushing through or trying to push through two checkpoints. Nikotayevka and Shebekino. They're about, the first one, Nikotayevka, is about 20 km due north of Kharkiv. Shebekino is about 30 km further east, around just up over the border from Vovchansk. This is, as I say, Russian authorities. Belgorod Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov saying the situation on the border was, quote, difficult but under control. And he said, our military is carrying out planned work. Please remain calm and my laugh. He said, trust only official sources of information. Right, do what you like with that. Now, Reuters are reporting Shot, a Telegram news channel, that's saying Ukrainian forces were pushed back with losses of personnel. However, another channel, MASH, that has links to the security services, said, well, that's where the 500 Ukrainian troop figure comes from, and said that there had been no clashes at the Shebekino border crossing point. So quite what's going on, we're not sure. If it's anything more than a raid, we don't know. A reconnaissance in force, perhaps, we don't know. Can't verify those numbers or any losses or anything like that, but something seems to have happened or is happening in the area of Belgorod. Elsewhere, Russia launched another wave of missile and drone strikes across Ukraine last night, killing 7, injuring 34, and said to have wiped out a hotel in the centre of the country. Air defence systems were deployed several times overnight, including in the capital, Kyiv, where there were at least 3 rounds of explosions. 2 people were killed when the hotel in central city of Kryvyi was destroyed, wiped out, in the words of Sergei Lysak, the governor of Dnipropetrovsk region. 2 more died in drone attacks in the Zaporizhia region in the south. The Kyiv Independent are saying that 81 Shahed-type attack drones and 10 missiles were used in this strike. Ukraine's military said this morning it had shot down 5 missiles and 60 drones during the attack, with 15 drones and several missiles said to be heading for, or rather all shot down, that were heading for Kyiv. Serhiy Popko, head of Kyiv's military administration, said, quote, everything that flew to the capital of Ukraine was destroyed. Now, Air Force Commander Mikhailo Ulashuk, speaking about the last 2 nights' attacks, and I'll come on to Sunday night's attack in a moment, but he said of the 2 nights of attacks, Russian forces launched 3 Kinzhal air-launched ballistic missiles from MiG-31 Kilo aircraft, 5 Kh-101 cruise missiles from Tupolev, the Tu-95, the long-range bombers, 1 Iskander-M ballistic missile and 1 Iskander-K cruise missile. So I should have said at the start, folks, I'm trying to work chronologically back from today. So that's why I've not mentioned the Sunday night attack yet. I will in a moment, though. Moving on, still sticking with today, looks like neither side, Russia nor Ukraine, made any big headway in Kursk, the Kursk Oblast operation over the weekend up to today. However, General Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, speaking this morning, he says Ukraine is continuing to make advances in the Kursk region. He was speaking at the Ukraine 2024 Independence Forum in Kyiv, where he said Ukrainian forces have taken control of more than 100 settlements in the Kursk border region and have taken 594 Russian soldiers prisoner. That exchange fund, as President Zelensky referred to it. You may remember last week, 115 Russian soldiers were swapped for the same number of Ukrainian prisoners in a prisoner swap. General Syrsky this morning said Ukraine controls 1,294 square kilometres of Russian soil in the Kursk region, and he said that 30,000 Russian troops have been deployed there as part of the efforts to get rid of Ukraine. However, elsewhere, Russia seems to be grinding on in the central Donetsk region, Pokrovsk, or aiming towards Pokrovsk. Notable, they've made, well, to put it in comparison, we talk about what's happening in Kursk, and it's seen as just Russia will say it's not a lot, but they've made about a kilometre. They're a kilometre closer to Pokrovsk today than they were this time last week. They're about 15 k's, we think, 15 k's southeast-ish of Pokrovsk. General Syrsky said the enemy is trying to withdraw units from other directions and is increasing its efforts in Pokrovsk sectors. Interestingly, Sergei Derishkin, Russia's foreign intelligence chief, proving that he's totally on message, speaking earlier today as well, says that Moscow does not believe Ukraine has planned the Kursk incursion by itself. I think I made this point a little bit, or dabbled with it last week. They've got to be careful here. They are desperate to deny Ukraine agency or say how little old Kyiv is capable of planning an invasion and seizing Russian land. They have to cast around for other actors, the US, NATO, or anybody, quite frankly, who's the brains behind it. But the longer and the harder they press that line, that it was the West and the US and NATO, the closer they're getting to yet another red line, really, showing, I think, yet again, that the Kremlin's red lines are at best drawn in non-permanent pen. Anyway, I mentioned that just so you're aware. Yesterday, overnight Sunday to Monday, Moscow launched what was been said is its biggest air attack of the war so far. Quite remarkable, 236 different missiles and drones. Poland said at least one drone had temporarily crossed into Polish airspace during the strikes. We think it got about 20, well, they said, I think it was high teens or low 20 kilometres-ish into Poland. There are no reports that it was shot down, but I question Poland, why? If not, why not? Separately, one of those killed in Monday's attack, or the overnight attack Sunday, Monday, was Ryan Evans, a British safety advisor for Reuters. He was killed when the Hotel Sapphire in Kramatorsk, where he was staying as part of a 6-person team, was hit. Russia claimed it destroyed a number of weapons depots, including, well, they say, at least one containing ammunition for F-16 jets. No verification there or comment from Kyiv. The Defense Ministry in Moscow said Russia launched the attack against, quote, critical energy infrastructure facilities supporting the work of Ukraine's military-industrial complex. Denis Shmyhal, the Ukrainian Prime Minister, said 15 regions across the country had sustained damage from the missile and drone attack. And Joe Biden said the attack on energy infrastructure was outrageous and said he had, quote, reprioritized US air defense exports so they are sent to Ukraine first. Interesting. He said the US was surging energy equipment to Ukraine to repair its systems and strengthen the resilience of Ukraine's energy grid. No comment there about giving permissions or what have you for long-range strikes using American kit inside Russia. Now, as you'd expect, Russian mill bloggers were delighted with the Sunday night's attack, as they will be with last night's. They saying that this was Russian retaliation for Ukraine's offensive into Kursk, which I thought was a very interesting comment. Because if Russia has the ability, has the stocks to fire hundreds of drones and precision missiles at the same time as they have thousands of enemy troops camped out on their territory, I think it says a lot about Moscow's ability to wage any kind of war other than meat assaults, that they choose to prioritize hitting or trying to hit Ukraine's energy infrastructure, or just terrorizing the civilian population. Neither those tactics have been shown to be successful in recent months. Instead of trying to mount some form of coherent effort to reclaim territory in Kursk. Now, I think this is because this Russian army is not good enough to mount the kind of combined arms effort needed to eject Ukraine's forces from Kursk. Even if they've got hundreds of missiles and drones at their disposal, all they can do, all it knows how to do is pound away and hope that Ukraine is eventually demoralised sufficiently to give up. So I'm not suggesting in any way that you take heart that it was only a missile and drone attack, because obviously it was very big, widespread, and people died. But I think it's telling, very telling, that if they had that at their disposal, they didn't try and do something about Kursk instead, because they can't. Now, also yesterday, Ukrainian forces reportedly attempted drone strikes on the Engels air base in Saratov Oblast inside Russia, about 500 kilometers northeast of Kharkiv, and also an oil refinery in Yaroslav Oblast, north of Moscow. Russia's MOD said that they had intercepted 9 drones over Saratov, 3 over Kursk, 2 each over Belgorod, Bryansk and Tula Oblasts, and 1 each over Oryol and Ryazan Oblasts overnight on Sunday, Monday. So those areas are all between Ukraine and Moscow. There's footage on social media showing a fixed-wing drone striking a building in Saratov city, probably going for the nearby Engels airbase. I think there were injuries and damage there. I don't think there were any reports of Russian killed, any civilians killed. Putting those two overnight attacks together, though, President Zelensky, speaking today, has vowed Ukraine will respond. He said rescue operations are ongoing this morning after the most recent overnight attacks. He said, "We will undoubtedly respond to Russia for this and all other attacks. Crimes against humanity cannot go unpunished." Now, those were his comments this morning, but they do echo words from a film that he put out, or the Ukrainian authorities put out on Saturday to mark Ukraine's 33rd Independence Day. It's about 12 or 13 minutes. It's worth a look, but some interesting quotes from it, just very briefly. President Zelensky said, "Ukrainians always pay back their debts, and whoever wished misery on our land shall find it in their own home with interest. Whoever seeks to sow evil on our land will reap its fruits on their own territory. This is not a prophecy, not gloating, not blind revenge. It is a pattern. It is justice, a boomerang for evil." Now, interestingly, he later the day went on to explain how Ukraine has used a new class of domestically produced drone to attack Russia for the first time. The Paliansia drone missile is what he says a completely new class of weapon, described to be as being highly maneuverable. It's a drone fitted with a jet engine and a very powerful warhead, so half drone, half missile, basically. Now, I don't apologise for getting the word wrong. I undoubtedly have done. Paliansia. Please tell me, those of you who know any better, how to pronounce that. But they've apparently gone for that name. It's a type of bread popular in Ukrainian culture because it's a very hard word for Russians to pronounce properly. It was used as a password, we are told, at Ukrainian checkpoints in the first few weeks of the full-scale invasion, given Russian soldiers' struggles to enunciate the term. Now then, going back another day, so Sunday now, Ukrainian Ministry for Foreign Affairs issued a warning to Belarus amid a recent build-up of Belarusian forces at Ukraine's northern border, where it borders Belarus's Gomel Oblast. Ukrainian intelligence services said on Sunday that Belarus had amassed forces in the area and had deployed a significant number of personnel, including from the former Wagner group. They said there were a lot of weapons and equipment being moved into the area. Ukrainian Ministry for Foreign Affairs warned Belarus against succumbing to Russian pressure and supporting Russia's war efforts against Ukraine. Ukraine's State Border Service spokesperson Andrei Demchenko subsequently said Ukrainian forces are fortifying the border area with Belarus as a response. And then just lastly for me, David, it is worth noting the Kavkaz oil depot near the town of Pokrovsk in Russia's Rostov region that was attacked by Ukrainian forces on August the 18th is still burning 8 days after it was hit. Satellite images confirming that. So that is a very, very large fire. There was concern at the end of last week by the Russian authorities that the oil or the fire that's engulfing the oil tanks would spread to the kerosene tanks for aviation fuel, and that would be firstly that would create a very big bang worth watching out for, but also that would dent the logistics supply for these long-range bombers and the MiGs that are firing these missiles into Ukraine. And I'll take a pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. Let's just round up a few political and diplomatic stories then to bring us up to speed before we go to our guest. The head of the International Nuclear Watchdog will visit a nuclear power plant in Kursk on Tuesday, which Vladimir Putin claimed Ukraine tried to attack last week. Rafael Grossi, chief of the International Atomic Energy Agency, said he will, quote, independently assess what is happening at the Russian power plant. Kiev did not respond to Putin's claim. More on that story as we get it, and I would point all of our listeners towards Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent's interview with Raphael Grossi for our sister podcast Battle Lines. I'll put a link to that interview, to that episode, in the show notes. Moving on, in the UK, the Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has said, quote, no new or different, end quote, decisions have been taken by his government in relation to the war in Ukraine after being asked whether Kiev should be able to use Storm Shadow missiles inside Russia. Speaking from the Rose Garden inside 10 Downing Street, the Prime Minister said, quote, in relation to Ukraine, as I've said many times, the position of this government is no different to the position of the last government. No new decisions or different decisions have been taken. We have put additional resources in terms of what we're providing, both money commitments and weapons commitments. Sir Keir continued, as I've said to President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine, we will stand with them for as long as it takes. I'm not going to get into tactical questions about the use of weapons for reasons which I know you'll understand. In other news, Politico is reporting that Ukrainian officials are preparing to present a list of long-range targets in Russia to top US national security officials that they think Kiev's military can hit if Washington were to lift its restrictions on US weapons. Politico calls this list a last-ditch effort to convince Washington to lift the restrictions on US weapons being used inside Russia. Some of the detail behind the story, then, is that Ukraine's defense minister, Rustem Umerov, and Andriy Yermak, senior advisor to President Zelensky, will be in Washington, D.C. this week, and that's where they plan to present this list to the administrations. This is, according to Politico, according to three people familiar with Ukraine's efforts who have been speaking to them. In a statement on Monday, Zelensky said there should be no restrictions on the range of weapons for Ukraine, while terrorists have no such restrictions. Defenders of life should face no restrictions on weapons. According to Politico, the National Security Council and the Pentagon both declined to comment. Just to get the Russian take on all of this, the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has said that Ukraine is, quote, blackmailing the West, end quote, by continuing to ask for permission to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike targets inside Russia. Lavrov also accused the West of, quote, playing with fire, end quote, as he confirmed Russia would be adjusting its nuclear weapons doctrine. Finally, Ukraine's PM, Denis Shmyhal, said that the country's budget deficit for 2025 will be $35 billion. However, assistance from partners will roughly cover $20 billion of that. Just to dive into this briefly, of that in the $20 million will be covered by the EU's Ukraine Facility Programme and by assistance from the International Monetary Fund. But as Shmyhal said, we still have this $15 billion not yet covered by agreements with our partners. Therefore, we understand that we will have to look for them either in our domestic sources or take some of the $50 billion from the frozen Russian assets, or keep working on how our partners can support us with this missing amount. Oh, finally from me, this is a breaking story reporting from the Kiev Independent, who write that President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced he will present US President Joe Biden with a plan for victory during a meeting in September. The president said that the proposal would also be presented to Vice President Kamala Harris and ex-President Donald Trump, the two candidates for the upcoming November presidential elections. We don't have any further details on what that plan might look like, but we'll try and bring you that in the coming days. Let's go then to our guest, Velina Tchakarova, security analyst based in Vienna. Velina, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start by looking at the visit of the Indian Prime Minister to Ukraine last week. This morning, Narendra Modi said he spoke with Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, following his visit to Ukraine. He, reporting today, says he, quote, exchanged perspectives on the war with Putin, and he's also tweeted that he spoke with Putin today and reiterated India's firm commitment to support an early, abiding and peaceful resolution of the conflict. His visit last week had mixed reviews. Indian news organisation The Wire said by not condemning the war, he was just a spectator, and said the visit was a hastily arranged, poorly thought-through event designed to erase the terrible optics of his visit to Moscow last month. Velina, what's your take on Modi's visit and the reaction of the Indian media? Are they being unfair?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me first wrap up the key takeaways from this historic visit by Prime Minister Modi to Ukraine. Now, this visit practically followed the visit to Poland. I think it's important to highlight this first visit to Poland also after 45 years. And obviously, the two were seen as a kind of a package, two legs of the same tour, practically the second important European visit following the first official visit by Prime Minister Modi immediately after his inauguration, which took place in Moscow, as we know, and was followed by a short visit to Austria. Now, we may already argue that this was meant to balance the European alliances and blocs, particularly linked, of course, to the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine. Now, we know for a fact that India in general, and that means, of course, Prime Minister Modi's government, have not openly blamed Russia for starting this war. And as we speak, India is currently importer number one of Russian oil with a share of around 44%, even actually overtaking China as the key customer. Now, that is a clear signal towards the strategic nature of the Russian-Indian relationship. That is why I would argue that, first and foremost, this visit by Modi to Ukraine was about diplomatic omnidirectionality. This is a new term that's been coined by a Singaporean diplomat Bilahari Kausikan, and practically gives you already an idea of an emerging global power, such is the case with India, that is going to try to reach out to each side of global and regional conflicts. Here particularly, I would argue that India has also coined itself as a future geopolitical bridge builder, taking the best from both worlds. On the one hand, deepening the relationship with the West, that means specifically United States, but also UK, the Anglo-Saxon world, but obviously by extension, Germany, France, Italy. We saw very important visits, and now with these two visits, coordinated visits to Poland and Ukraine, I would argue that this has been certainly a win-win from the perspective of Ukraine. Why? Because obviously, first and foremost, President Zelensky and his team had the opportunity to give their version of what's been going on since February 2022. Up until now, Prime Minister Modi had the chance, of course, to talk to Zelensky in person, but now being in Kiev, talking to all these important people, he could actually get the other version of this war. So, geopolitical bridge builder, diplomatic omnidirectionality, this is going to be part of the strategic portfolio of Prime Minister Modi. What I would take from these statements is India's growing role as mediator. I'm not expecting specific input when it comes to the Russian war against Ukraine, but in general, I would be expecting a much stronger role of New Delhi in various global and regional conflicts. The very fact that India also has sent a representative to the peace conference in Switzerland, even though that India did not vote on the communique, is something that I would actually rather assess as a positive sign. Now, we know for a fact that India's defense relationship with Ukraine is deeply rooted, with Ukrainian defense manufacturers playing also critical role in supplying and maintaining key components of India's military hardware. Now, given the ongoing war in Ukraine, we've seen also how this has disrupted global and regional supply chains. Maintaining these ties is crucial from India's perspective, especially given the strategic goal of reducing the dependence on Russian arms supplies in general, but also there is this fear on behalf of India that Russia might not actually meet its ongoing and future commitments. I think that this is also important from Ukraine's position, given the fact that Ukraine is struggling to find as many international partners, not only in the defense sector, but beyond. And obviously the visit resulted in concrete outcomes by signing 4 key agreements covering agriculture. We know for a fact how important it is for Ukraine to strengthen its agricultural sector, but also medicine, culture, and humanitarian assistance. This, in my view, was also another strong signal, because the focus on economic and technological cooperation aligns also with India's objective to enhance its regional influence in Europe. And now, obviously, we see this emphasis on Central and Eastern Europe, which, from my perspective, is an important point.
Thank you so much for that overview. Why do you think he felt the need, that's Modi, to follow up today with a phone call? Has his visit caused some domestic headaches as well?
Well, we've seen for a fact that during Prime Minister's visit to Kiev, there hasn't been a single airstrike. And from my perspective, this would be my argument, is that India has certainly coordinated the visit of Prime Minister Modi to Ukraine with its Russian counterparts. We know for a fact that there are different channels of communication. And it was kind of cynical how these particular airstrike-free days contradict to the reality, followed by the worst number of airstrikes on various destinations in Ukraine. And practically this is one of the worst moments for Ukraine since the beginning of the war. So you see clearly an escalation on behalf of Russia. Then we've heard also about the current successful counteroffensives by Ukraine. And the Indian side is, I would argue, a little bit overwhelmed right now, trying to grasp the complexity of this story, as I think that it is still very, very escalatory part we are witnessing right now that is hard to be understood from outside, especially if you are currently sitting in South Asia.
One more question from me then before we go to Dom. Velina, in your view, how influential is India when it comes to Russia and this war, particularly given India's competition with China?
Well, that is, of course, the 1 million question here, because we've been asking the same question about China's influence on Moscow for the last 2.5 years, right? And the simplified answer is almost zero influence on Moscow's decisions, or if you like, Putin's decisions, linked concretely to the ongoing war. But there is some influence when it comes to the ripple effects this ongoing war has had and is having on global economy, global trade, and specifically the global south. Ripple effects such as food insecurities and energy insecurities, disruption of global supply chains and regional supply chains, reconfiguration of transport corridors, energy corridors, and so on and so forth. Here, I would argue, India certainly has a saying, because if you erase India, and by extension, China, from the equation of comprehensive support, which comes from all these important commodities that Russia is still effectively putting on the global markets, we would see a very dire picture for the war economy of Russia, and by extension for the networks Russia currently is sustaining with the so-called global south. So this is, I would argue, a kind of indirect way of putting some points on the bilateral but also multilateral agenda by powers like India. And as I said, I would even go further by the key systemic competitor of the United States, which is China, when it comes to Russia.
Hi, Velina. Dom here. Thank you so much for joining us today. Long been very interested in your commentary and analysis. Now, you have coined the term dragon bear to describe the very intricate relationship between Russia and China and their joint challenge to the post-war international order, or the international system. How dangerous do you think the dragon bear is in 2024, and is enough being done to challenge it or contain it?
Let me first highlight very shortly for our audience, and especially for those who are not familiar with this dragon bear coin, what the dragon bear isn't, namely a strategic alliance or a military pact between China and Russia. What the dragon bear has been over the last 10 years, as I've been dealing with this very complex relationship since actually the first invasion of Russia in 2014. And I've been pointing to the Dragon Bear as a modus vivendi of comprehensive coordination in all strategic domains. So it started more or less top-down, injected by the strong political will by Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping on both sides. But meanwhile, what we are seeing is the manifestation of this comprehensive modus vivendi of coordination, starting from the commodity sector, specifically energy, and then going through various key domains, agriculture, also the military technological complex, the space cooperation, defense sector anyway. So we have really all these layers of the modus vivendi that make actually this relationship extremely dangerous from the perspective of the United States, first and foremost, because it's facing not one but two players coordinating against the American power projection around the world, and by extension quite dangerous from European perspective, as the Western European powers are currently quite split, specifically when it comes to the strategic consensus. In my view, that's what's been most lacking since 2022 about the ultimate goal of this war. From our perspective, we should be actually all on the same page, saying that Ukraine has to restore its independence per 1991. That's not happening on behalf of the Western powers, obviously. And here, once again, we have actually a lot of modus vivendi of coordination also when it comes to narratives, when it comes to the nature of warfare, that is a war that's being waged by non-military means in all these sectors. So I would finish by claiming that, in my view, that's still very much underestimated in terms of its scope and in terms of actually its scale of engagement, but also ability to exercise targeted influence on a specific group of state and non-state actors around the world.
Thanks, Velina. And you are, of course, correct to rein me in slightly. The Dragon Bear is not a description of anything formal between China and Russia, but it is a different construct to, for example, the Warsaw Pact or the Soviet Union, in that they align on very many areas that are a challenge to the West and the rules-based international order, but in many places have their root in from very different start points. So do you think that the closer relationship between China and Russia is going to see a more transactional requirement from Western foreign policy regarding countries such as India? It's no longer the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's much more nuanced than that. Do you think can this be viewed through the similar lenses of the Cold War, or is this a very different problem set for Western foreign policy chiefs?
I think that we are facing a very different problem set, not only from Western point of view, but also from India's point of view, or if you like, but from Global South's point of view. First and foremost, because of the interconnectedness of global affairs, security is no longer just about security and defense, as well as economy is no longer just about trade relations or commodities and so on. And so for that, these two major dimensions of the global affairs have been of the difference between them, the gap between them has been obfuscated. And again, of course, we are in a situation in which nobody even can predict what kind of global order we will be facing in 5 or 10 years from now. So we have very contradictory prognoses, very different assessments about the future, about the nature of the global order. And here everybody has to make a call, has to work with a hypothesis in order to understand the motivations and the interests of these key players. My base scenario right now is still one that's more centered around bifurcation of the global system, centered around China and United States. Obviously, Russia in a kind of asymmetric, but certainly not junior partner-like relationship with China. Same goes for the European powers when it comes to the relationship ship with the United States. And now here we have a huge gray zone of the so-called global south with powerful players, meanwhile, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, on top of which India, which are oscillating in between, trying actually to avoid any scenario in which they have to take sides, in which they have to align. Now, some may argue, well, that could be the future non-alignment movement. But again, we are not in a Cold War reality. This Cold War 2.0, these middle powers will have a lot of leverage over the two powerful geopolitical blocs. Some actually argue, meanwhile, that we may even witness a volatile and very chaotic multipolarity. That means not bifurcation, but polyforcation of the global system. And here, once again, it means more chaos. It means, on the one hand, more leverage, specifically for countries like India, but also middle powers are countries that will have specific geographic advantages, or they will have the access to critical raw materials, or they will have very, very important technologies, such as the case with Taiwan in the chips industry. So they will have certain leverage and they will play off powerful systemic competitors against each other. But even if we agree this would be the two main scenarios, still the number of military conflicts and wars, the intensity of which will actually further increase, unfortunately.
Just on that point, I'd like to ask you about the intensity of conflict at the moment. I'll ask you that in just a minute. But you were talking there about the future non-aligned movements and the attempt by, well, the West and by Russia, you say that the two geopolitical blocs, to appeal to them. And in that effort to appeal to the non-aligned, how dangerous is the Kursk incursion operation, whatever we're going to call it, to someone like Putin? Forget the geographic size, but in a bid to appeal to the non-aligned movement, how big a deal do you think this whole Kursk incursion is?
Well, obviously, what we are observing right now is actually a successful counteroffensive by Ukraine to try to not just find a weak spot in the current Russian military system, but actually to invoke a tipping point. And that's been the case over 2.5 years because of the asymmetry of numbers. And obviously, because the Western powers have promised a lot and delivered little, Ukraine has been put in an impossible situation to try anything, no matter how desperate it could look like in first sight. So I would argue that this, of course, hits a lot of the credibility of the Russian army, that's for sure. But the question still remains, is this going to be a tipping point for this war? And in my view, our Western approach has been very clear right from the beginning, and it has been centered around exactly 3 dimensions. Military aid, as much as it takes, whenever it takes. Sanctions, again, as much as it takes. And then, third important dimension, diplomatic support and winning the hearts and minds of exactly that, the global south. Now, I would still argue, as we speak, that despite the successful counteroffensives that we've been seeing again and again on behalf of the courageous Ukrainian troops in all 3 years, if you take a look at the 3 dimensions, the West hasn't been doing its homework on all 3 points. We haven't been delivering enough as we've promised. We have been bypassing our own sanctions, and we did not win the hearts and minds of the global south when it comes to the Russian war against Ukraine.
Thank you. And just finally, looking a bit broader and back to Dragon Bear, you talk about the intensification of conflict a moment ago. How do you explain the recent uptick in China's very aggressive behaviour? The Chinese Navy's very aggressive behaviour towards Philippines Coast Guard in particular, but the Philippines more broadly in the South China Sea, the ramming of ships and so on and so forth. What do you think is going on there? Just in the last few weeks, it's really, really got extremely violent there.
Well, it's logical. It's been anticipated, it's been expected, and in our community of geopolitical strategists, we are almost all on the same, page regarding the activities coming from China, even when actually China and the Philippines concluded the deal to scale down the escalation. Again, the trust was violated, and again, China started pressing on the escalation button. That is absolutely clear from my perspective in terms of the interconnectedness also of the hotspots right now. You have the big Indo-Pacific terrain. That's the most strategic one from China's perspective. China is preparing for the moment when United States will refocus and will start being more active immediately after the US election. This is just a preparatory work. We are just getting a sense of what is actually about to come. At the same time, Russia is also pressing on the escalation button right now ahead of the election in November, trying to get as much as it can in anticipation, let's say, of re-election of Trump, because Moscow knows very well that Trump will only go into any kind of talks or negotiations from the position of the strong and not of the weak. But you need to understand that these two, together with the military conflict in the Middle East, which is now called the West Asia, are interlinked hotspots where China and Russia clearly coordinates positions, disseminate same narratives, support same side. And this is described as the strategic sphere of influence of China, the Indo-Pacific, similarly as China accepted Russia's strategic sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, not just Ukraine. You need to understand that it's not just a war about the very existence of Ukraine, but actually about the future of the security architecture in the whole continent.
Coming up, we hear Dom and Velina's final thoughts. Well, thank you so much, Velina, for your time today. Let's go to our final thoughts, and Velina will come back to you to hear your summation of some of your thinking on the direction of the war and the future. But Dom Nicholls, can I come to you first? Dom.
Yeah, I note this morning at that forum I mentioned earlier on, General Syrskyi also said that one of the objectives of the Kursk operation was to divert a significant number, his words, divert a significant number of Russian forces from other sectors. And he singled out Donetsk for this, Pokrovsk and the area around there. Now, if he's saying that's one of the objectives, we assess that as well. We said, it's one of a number. So I don't think he's saying that that's not worked. I do note that there's a number of commentators saying that Kursk has failed because it's not relieved pressure on Pokrovsk. I think that assessment is wrong. And I think that Putin now cannot not take Pokrovsk because of the Kursk operation. He has to come away with some sort of a win. There's not been an awful lot going in Russia's direction in the last few months. This grinding assault, moving slowly forward, meat assaults, as we've discussed, it's not really doing an awful lot and can't be kept up indefinitely. Can go for a long time, as we've discussed before, but not indefinite. Now, his inability to retake Kursk right now means that he has to do everything in his power to claim some sort of victory. So Pokrovsk is now being talked up as a strategic win. Do you remember when Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Chasiv Yar were all said to be strategic wins? Bakhmut and Avdiivka didn't fundamentally change things when Russia took those areas, and the Chasiv Yar is still held by Ukraine. So Putin has to take Pokrovsk and therefore prioritises his forces there, thinning out the lines elsewhere to go and fight in Kursk. There are reports of small Ukrainian advances, possibly only raids, but keep your eye on the Kherson region, Kharkiv to a certain extent, but there seems to be some sort of movement down south. But I don't think you're going to see a large withdrawal of Russian troops from Pokrovsk and the Donetsk region, simply because he has to win there. He has to succeed because he's not succeeding elsewhere, and certainly not succeeding in Kursk.
Thank you very much. Dom, Velina, as our guest, would you like the very final thoughts?
No, actually, I absolutely agree that this is the goal right now. And I completely agree with this assessment that the Russians will continue to advance at Pokrovsk. This is absolutely necessarily. But I also would like to point to Syrskyi's warning, I think just a few weeks ago, when he highlighted that up to almost 700 Russian soldiers will be available by the end of the year. Let's keep the numbers in mind, because I would argue deal a little bit lightly with this strategic dimension of the war. The war is continuing. It's going to continue beyond 2025. And we are just not acting strategically. And we, of course, I mean our political decision makers in the West when it comes to this war.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.